welcome back to yet another Universal Story Q&A. Thank you so much for coming out to support these. I'm very excited about tonight, as is Gizmo here. It's going to be a fun night. So when I was a kid, I was terrified of everything. Everything scared me. The first movie I saw in a theater was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and I just left the theater screaming and crying. I couldn't handle anything. Christopher Lloyd terrified me. So that being said, when I was 8 years old and I was at my best friend Matt's birthday party, and he opened up one of his gifts and it was Gremlins on VHS, and they all decided we were going to watch it after eating birthday cake, I was just trying to think, call my mom, get her here, get me out of here. I was scared to death of the movie poster. I sure wasn't going to watch the movie. So they turn on the VHS, and I'm hiding behind the wall, behind a couch over here, like just peeking over the corner. I just don't want to be there. And you hear the music start, Darlene Love, the Christmas song playing. You see a little girl get nailed by a snowball, and everyone starts laughing. And I start thinking, well, this isn't a horror movie. This isn't scary. This is funny. So you spend the next half hour laughing and seeing this cute guy, and I'm just like, that guy's adorable. I just fell in love with Gizmo. And then the poor guy got wet, and we all know what hell broke free from there. But I wasn't scared watching this movie. It was fun. I felt like I was in a clubhouse. I felt like I was part of some sort of secret club watching this movie I couldn't believe existed. I was so excited. And when the movie ended, I was a diehard fan, to say the least, buying all the toys and the little gizmos that you stick on the windows is referenced in Gremlins 2. And I fell in love with a filmmaker by the name of Joe Dante. The movies that he has made, Matinee, The Howling, INNERSPACE, The BURBS. I know many of you studio tour guides here tonight spiel about the films that he shot on this very backlot every day. So it is very exciting for me to introduce tonight's guest, filmmaker, Mr. Joe Dante.
Thanks, Jason. You know, I've done a lot of these kind of things, but I never had an opening act before. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader, for your Magic Castle opening act. I just like to start by asking you, for someone who grew up a fan of classic Universal monster movies, someone who literally reinvented the werewolf genre with The Howling, and someone who shot films on this studio backlot, multiple films, what is it like for you to be back here walking through the gates of Universal Studios? Is it nostalgic? Is it what do you feel when you're on this lot?
Well, you know, before I came to Hollywood and my only experience watching movies was on TV and in the movies, I was very close to Universal. My theater, the Colony Theater in Livingston, New Jersey in the 50s, for some reason had a deal where they just ran every Universal picture, particularly the Westerns. So I grew up on Audie Murphy and all of those. They're always in color, and they're always shot more or less on the back lot, which is one of the only places in the lot that really has changed the least, I think, since the old days. And when I first came out in 1973, of course, I immediately went on the tour, such as it was at the time. And, you know, the tour started back in the 20s with Carl Laemmle had the people sat on bleachers and watched them make silent movies, and they could make as much noise as they wanted. It became a little more difficult when when I was making movies here. When I was doing the Burbs up on the what is, I guess, called Desperate Housewives World, which is an amazing place on the lot, because when I first came out in '73, the lot was much different than it is now, and it was much more like it had been in the '50s, where there was what I think was the world's greatest suburban backlot, where Amblin is now. And but you can see it in countless movies, particularly Inherit the Wind. It's used extensively. But when I came out here, I thought that was the greatest backlot ever. But it wasn't. It didn't take long for Amblin to sort of take it over, and so all the buildings that were there, not all the buildings, but most of them, had to be moved somewhere. So they moved them up to the top of the hill, and they, without any particular thought about any matching anything, they would just put a house here and a house here and a house here. So the House of the Seven Gables is next to Marcus Welby's house, and the Munster's house is across the street. And so there's all these bizarre architectural. I mean, it's very California, and all the architectural stuff up there it's completely doesn't match. But nonetheless, it has its own sort of character. And so when it came time to do the Burbs, which was originally planned to be shot in a real location, like in Omaha or something, I said, no, this story doesn't work this way. As I had said about Gremlins, it's got to be a stylized setting. It can't just look like real life. It's got to look like a movie. And so we shot the Burbs up in that area during a writer's strike, and so we were able to sort of improvise the entire picture from the beginning to end, because the writer was there. I put him in the movie just to have him on the set, but he wasn't allowed to contribute anything. And so there's that particular part of the lot is very nostalgic for me, because a number of the buildings are still there, and this lot has always been very special to me. And when I first came out here, the remnants of the Black Lagoon were still there. The castle, the Tower of London, and the Warlord was still there. The Frankenstein Village which I think had burned down like 12 times, still had a lot of areas where you could say this is actually the alley where Boris Karloff skulked in The Invisible Ray, and this is the archway that Ralph Bellamy runs through in The Wolfman. I mean, you could really spot these things, and it's very, all backlots are very moving to me for whatever reason, because I always feel some sort of kinship with the ghosts that inhabited that space. And Warner Brothers has actually still got some stuff left that goes back to the 30s. And so backlots are very magical to me. And the time that I've spent here, I had a deal here once, a couple times actually, back in the days when people actually had deals, and they paid you to like have an office, and you'd have somebody to develop your projects and all that kind of stuff. It kind of went away, along with most of the lot. I mean, the Hitchcock bungalow used to be right up in this area, and then they sort of moved it, away. But my memories of this lot are inextricably entwined with the movies that I saw when I was a kid, and the movies that I continued to see. So it's always a treat to come here. And so when Jason said, would you come up and, talk to the folks up here, I said, sure, I love being on this lot.
Very nice. After each thought, they'll applaud you. So So I spent the majority of my time working for Universal so far at Universal Studios Florida, and there I was a VIP guide, and one of the big things that we would talk about was Matinee shot here. What was the difference shooting at Universal Studios Florida when you shot that film?
Well, that movie was set in Key West, and most of Key West had been built up and didn't look like it did in 1962 when the film is set. And so we did shoot a great deal of it on the backlot, particularly the movie within the movie, which is called Mant, all, half man, half ant, all terror. And again, it was an affectionate parody of a lot of movies that were made in that period, particularly by Universal. And we used a lot of tracks from the Universal Music Library to make the movie seem more authentic. And that I haven't really been back there in a while, but that was a very really nicely designed lot. I mean, it was it was open to the public. I mean, people, there were stores and things in it, much like up at City Walk, but it was more extensive and it was more detailed. The thing that disappointed me about the current backlot after the town square and that where we shot Gremlins and the environment around there, they burned down. After Newsies was made here, they did an extensive revamp of the backlot, and it really looked terrific. But after it burned down again, the new version of it isn't quite as detailed as the old version. There's whole walls that instead of being actually worked out, they're just paintings. And I sort of miss that, because I do think that even as it is now, logistically, it's one of the best backlots. And I know that I also did my homework before I came here, and I took the tour last month. to see the difference between, when the various tours that I've taken, and the use of technology is really amazing. I mean, what areas that used to be semi-clunky are now, very state of the art, and even old hoary things like the earthquake, thing, and the collapsing bridge and all that stuff. They still work. I mean, the part in the Red Sea maybe not so much, but it's really been done very well. And also, I was very pleased to see that the amount of misinformation that is being dispensed by the tour guides is much reduced. And there seem to be people who actually know what they're talking about. And because when I first came out here, it was like every time they turned around, well, Gone with the Wind was shot over here. And it was just like it was Movieville. Nobody cared what movie. It was just movies were shot here. And now I think, there's so much attention to the past and the use of the posters and all that stuff. I mean, I think that the current administration is really into the legacy. Obviously, with the Mummy screening here tonight. I mean, they've gone back to the original inspirations, and they're trying to reboot them for modern audiences, and which is very smart. But I think not losing sight of what brought us here is one of the great things about being on the lot and being part of the tour.
What is it like filming a movie on the lot here with the trams coming through?
That was one of the interesting things. When I took my first tour, they went down to the lower lot, and I saw Claude Akins and some other actors shooting an episode of Sheriff Lobo. And the tour guide was saying, over there we have and really loud, and we drove right by, and the actors continued to speak, and nobody said cut or anything. And that was when I realized why so many of the Universal television shows sounded a little hollow. And it was because they realized it was much cheaper to dub everything than it would be to stop the tour from going by something that was being photographed. Because, I mean, I can't remember exactly what the number was, but somebody had said that each one of the trams was worth X number of $1,000. And so when I was doing the Burbs, we kept getting dailies in, and we would listen hard, and we would hear, oh no, and it was the Jaws ride. And we got rid of it and everything, but it's the art and commerce thing, and as much as we like the art, it is transitory, and the commerce is here forever, as you can see from this lot that was built so long ago, and is now really one of the going concerns in Southern California.
How difficult was it, by the way, to get Matinee made, and where did the decision come to film it in Florida? Was it because the studio or the theme park was brand new that you decided, or that the studio decided they wanted to shoot it there?
Well, Matinee was a project that originated at Warner Brothers, and they didn't really want to make it. And it was originally a much different conception than what we ended up making. But when Universal agreed to distribute the movie, and we supposedly have funds from overseas, the famous overseas funds, and we went down to Florida because it needed to be set where it was supposedly happening, and the money kept not showing up every Tuesday, and so Universal would grant us, they'd pay that week's wages, and the financiers would say, well, next Tuesday there'll be money. And then next Tuesday would roll around, and there was no more money. And so finally, I went to the heads of the studio, and I said, look, you guys have already spent a bunch of money on this picture. Why don't you just take it over and, make the picture, make it a Universal picture? And they left the room, and they came back, and they said that passion has won out over sense. And we'll go ahead and, fund the movie, which was about $14 million. And when they saw the movie, they said, this is a nice movie, but how are we going to sell it? which of course was in the back of my head all along, was like, this is really not a studio picture. It was really kind of a Miramax kind of a movie. It was the kind of movie that you open in a couple of theaters and try to get some good reviews, and then you build on it. But instead, they opened it like in a zillion theaters, and of course it didn't do anything. But what was nice was that I would go and I would see people bringing their kids to see this movie that took place in 1962 and saying, this is what your dad and mom used to go to. The theaters used to have only one screen. And we used to go and see these movies. And this is the world we lived in, and we thought the world was going to end because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was sort of an educational thing. And now, over the years, obviously, it's become a kind of a cult movie. But it was one of those things where it was a pure fluke that Universal decided to step up and make the picture, for which I've always been grateful.
And talking about filming movies with children, a lot of your movies are through the eyes of kids, but they deal with heavy subject matter. And they don't feel, even as a kid watching your movies, I never felt like I was watching a movie made for kids. Even in a movie like Small Soldiers, which was promoted to be like a live-action Toy Story, you're getting commentary on war and religion, and Explorers as well is another great example of movies that don't talk down to kids. Is that something that you felt like you had as a kid, movies for kids but not made to just be aimed at children?
Well, I don't have any kids, but for some reason, when I look back on my filmography, it's filled with children. There's always kids in my movies. The only one that made any money was Gremlins, so I'm not so sure what a good idea it is to have children in my movies. I like kid actors. I really like. I mean, Ethan Hawke was not an actor when he came to the audition for Explorers. He came with another kid. He was just a friend of some kid, and I said, "Gee, this kid is really kind of interesting. Let's see if he can. Let's just bring him in." And he ended up getting the lead in a Paramount picture, And now, of course, he's Ethan Hawke, and the same thing with River Phoenix, who was another terrific actor. And it's sort of like being a dad for a summer when you have to work with kids, because you're sort of the one that they relate to. And I certainly don't regret. I mean, I regret the fact that these movies didn't make any money, but I don't regret the fact that I made them, because it was such a rich experience being able to be with those kids. And I'm sure that, there have been so many kids in my movies who've grown up now and are like, adults, that I'm sure that there'll be more in the future.
How many, you mentioned spending time on the lot here with an office. How many years was that you were at Universal?
I was here. I had... back in the days when they used to take you through Lucille Ball's dressing room, I had an office on the BURBS that was, I guess, where the Jurassic Park ride is now. And it was great. It was a big office. I put up posters. I mean, it was really a lot of fun. John Landis had an office right near me. And then on Small Soldiers, we had another office in the building with the Showa. Is that still there? The Showa building. Spielberg had a Showa. They just took it down. Well, anyway, in that building was where our offices were, and it's being on a lot is just so much fun. I mean, the commissary I see has gotten very corporate, but in the old days, it used to have all these ripped up movie posters and a collage, and it was like you didn't want to go on the fancy side; you wanted to go on the movie poster side, even though the food wasn't as good, just to be near the movie posters, Also, when I first came here, the mansion, which is now up on the hill, used to be down by where the beginning of Amblin is. And if you see a movie like Harvey, which uses the mansion quite a bit, you can see right off. The great thing was the golf course is right behind it, and so it was like free cyclorama for the art director, because right over the river was all this greenery. And I do remember also somebody saying the first time I came, Bruce Berman worked here as assistant to Sean Daniel, and I came in and I said, "Why are you so upset?" And he said, "Somebody pooped in the mansion last night." So I guess they had their share of people who were coming over the wall, like at the White House,
I don't think that there's anyone working in the industry with a pure love of film than you. I don't think so. What in your time, either working on the lot or even making your films, has there been a moment where you just had a fan moment where I can't believe I'm talking to this person?
Yeah, that happened a lot. I mean, every time I would work with an actor that I had grown up with, I would like be so impressed that I was actually in the same room with them. But oddly enough, people say, "Whoa, did you get autographs?" And it was like, no, I never felt the need to have an autograph. And I guess maybe it's because I had the experience of working with them. But so many of the actors that I liked, I would find parts for in other movies. And so if you look at my movies, you see the same people reappearing over and over until they pass away, which is a number of them have done. And it's because when you meet people that you get along with, particularly actors, you want to work with them again. You have this shorthand that you you kind of know what the other person is thinking without having to do a lot of directing and a lot of talking because you're on the same wavelength. And that goes for crew people and it goes for composers. I worked with Jerry Goldsmith for many, many years, and we even though I don't read music, we had a sort of a relationship where he always knew exactly what it was that I wanted. Even if I went to the scoring session and I said, this needs to be sadder or slower or whatever, I mean, he would just reorchestrate it on the spot. And I mean, there's just, there's something to be said for just relationships in this business where if you get along with somebody, and I can't think of a single person that I've worked with who I didn't want to work with again, it just enriches you. I mean, we all talk about the auteur theory and, in television, the writer is king and all that stuff, but it takes a lot of people to do this stuff. And it's all a group effort. And, if a grip gives me an idea better than the one I've got, I'm going to use it.
As a kid, I was really into animation. I collect animation books, and I wanted to go to art school. And something that stands out in your films is characters that are even puppets come off as loonier than the Looney Tunes sometimes. What's really cool to see in your movies is all of the tributes. I mean, even having not only Chuck Jones appear in Gremlins, but then Chuck Jones directing Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck in Gremlins 2, which is just incredible. And then you directing a Looney Tunes film. You wanted to be a cartoonist originally when you were a kid?
I did. I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I was a huge cartoon fan. And when I first went to the matinees, the Saturday matinee, a long-vanished tradition, which I think is a shame because it really taught kids to love movies, I would stay for the 10 cartoons and I'd leave. Didn't matter what the movie was, I'd leave. And one day I stayed to see It Came from Outer Space in 3D. And even though it had nothing but adults in it, which was always a problem for me, I thought, yeah, this is pretty good. So I became a movie addict at the age of like 8 or whatever. And there was a movie theater that we could walk to in New Jersey. And so I was there every weekend, every Saturday and every Sunday. If you got in there an hour early, the first boy and the first girl in line got in for free, which meant you could take your quarter and spend it on concession stuff. And believe me, with a quarter, you could buy candy, popcorn, and a soda for a quarter. And if the movie was boring, you spent most of your time just looking up and down through the aisles for money on the floor to see if you could get more candy. But I got into this habit, and it was like I loved the movies. And this is before we had a TV. So maybe that explains it. But when we did get a TV, and in those days it was black and white, and the movies were tended to be kind of old. But as much as I loved watching movies on TV and watching cartoons on TV, I really, really loved the idea of going to the movies and seeing movies with an audience. And the one thing that I regret today, in a world where we now have access, thankfully, to so many movies that were just off limits that we could never see for years, maybe 70 years. These movies now come to light in these great prints and all that stuff, and we can stream them and we can watch them on Blu-ray and DVD. Nothing matches seeing a movie with an audience. And I think we've lost something. I mean, I just think that the experience that made me love movies was not a tunnel vision one of me just looking at it by myself. It was always being in an audience. And I think that now that so many movies go directly to VOD, to watch a comedy in a theater like this with an audience and to watch the same movie for the first time on your computer, it's not the same movie. When the Marx Brothers were in their heyday, they would take their material out on the road and they would run it they would do plays in front of audiences, and they would gauge where the laughs were. And then when we go back to MGM or Paramount or wherever, they would leave spaces in the scenes for where they knew the laughs were. Now, if you see those movies on TV today, it's just dead air. It's just like, well, why wasn't anything happening? You know, and it's because there's supposed to be laughs there. And so it's not the same experience to see on TV. I mean, glad we have them. I'm glad these movies still exist. But until you've seen A Night at the Opera with an audience that I saw in Woodstock, New York in 1961, who were laughing so hard that people had to leave the theater because they were starting to gasp, you know, and not be able to breathe. I just don't know where that kind of experience can be found today.
Having grown up in Florida, there was very few places that would screen classic films. And when I moved here, it was just like a kid in a candy store. And one of the first things that I went to go see was a double feature of The Burbs and Matinee at the Egyptian. What is it like for you to see theaters of people quoting your movie, sitting out in the audience, coming to see The Burbs over and over again?
Well, it's weird. I mean, you know, because The Burbs was, you know, got the worst reviews since Mein Kampf. And just this weekend, I went to Portland, Oregon, where they asked me to come up and introduce a screening of The Burbs for this packed audience. And I said, "So how many people have seen this movie before?" And like, you know, 7/8 of them, like, oh, it's like they already know the movie. They've seen it 100 times. They can talk back to the screen. They know the dialogue. There are websites about it. There's a trivia book about The Burbs. And yet here are people paying good money to sit in an audience and laugh at the movie with people that are like-minded with themselves. And it was very fun. It was a nice thing to see. And it's nice when that happens. It's nice to be there for that. Not that you can sit through the movie again, you know. I mean, you know it by heart, but it is just it's nice to be able to see things being appreciated in person, as opposed to somebody writes you a letter and says, "I liked your movie. I saw it on VHS," which is great, but it's not the same.
Do you find yourself going to a lot of screenings at the New Beverly or any of the theaters in town?
Well, when I first came out here in the 70s, I had the same reaction you did. And also, there were a lot of theaters. There was the Encore. There was the Fox Venice. There was all these theaters that they specialized in running old movies. And here we are in Hollywood, where there were studio prints for people to run. So I managed to finagle myself into FilmX one year and talk them into a science fiction marathon, during which we got to screen all of the studio prints of, you know, This Highland Earth and Village of the Damned and all these movies, and program them, and also get access to the trailers for them, which is when I started thinking about doing Trailers from Hell, which is my website, which
Seen Trailers from Hell, by the way. Talk a little bit.
Trailers from Hell is on the internet for free. One of the few things in life that's a bargain, at www.trailersfromhell.com. And what it is it's there's about 1,500 trailers on there with commentary by contemporary filmmakers who talk about the movie if it inspired them, talk about the movie because they think that you should see it, or whatever. But it started out just with me and a bunch of trailers that I had collected, and I put it up on the internet, and I said, anybody can do that. Maybe I'll just do a couple of commentaries. And so I did some commentaries. And they sat there for a little while. And some of my friends saw them and said, hey, you know, I have a picture I'd like to talk about. And it just started to grow. And now we have, I think, like 50 different filmmakers who have been doing commentaries for us, from everybody from John Landis to Edgar Wright to Guillermo del Toro, and a lot of writers, Rick Baker. I mean, there's a lot of interesting people who talk about movies that you may or may not know about, and it's always fascinating to see what they think. And the great thing is, it's short attention span theater because these trailers are only 3 minutes long. So I urge you to check it out. It's very addictive, and you'll probably find. The best thing is people come up to me and say, you know, I never heard of this movie until I saw it on your site, and I went out and got it, and I love it. Now I love the director. I want to see his other movies. And these are pictures that go back from silent days to like last year. So I would urge you to check it out.
Talk a little bit. I know you probably are sick of it at this point, talking about the original Gremlins, but I just love this.
Sick of talking about that.
Then we'll move on. But I love the stories. Just talk a little bit about the original R-rated version of the Gremlins and how that became the movie that it did finally
What do
become.
you mean the R-rated version? It never got
Well, a
rated.
head bouncing down the stairs probably wouldn't have been a PG
We might have been able
film.
to talk him into a PG. Chris Columbus's original script was written on spec. A spec script is a script that you write not thinking that maybe it'll be produced, but that it shows people what you can do, and then maybe you'll get hired to write a different script. So he wrote this horror film, this Gremlins horror film, and which Steven Spielberg happened to find, and decided he wanted to make it his first production for Amblin, his new company. And because I had just done The Howling, he figured it as a sort of a low-budget horror film that would be made in maybe Oregon for not much money. And when we started working on it, it became apparent that in order to make this look believable, it was going to cost more than $1.98. And so he went to Warner Brothers and asked them, to fund the movie. And it became a little bigger. But in the meantime, it also became a lot less horrific. The genius part of Gremlins, and the reason I think that it's still a popular classic, is that about 4 weeks before we started shooting, Steven decided that the Gizmo character, this fuzzy little bag of bolts, who in our script turned into the bad gremlin, Stripe, after about a half an hour, shouldn't turn into the bad gremlin, Stripe. He should stay being Gizmo for the whole movie and be the hero's pal and be a character in the movie. And it was a brilliant idea. It's the reason I think that the movie has worked. But also, it was terrifying for us because we had never imagined that this little character was going to have to carry a whole movie, and we didn't have the technology to do it. He was very small. There were a lot of gears in his head, and it was like, how are we going? He couldn't walk. He had to be carried around. So how are we going to sustain the illusion that this is a real character for an entire movie? So we worked really hard, and we managed to get him to sign off on the design by making it the same color as his Cocker Spaniel, and then we built a giant Gizmo head that could do more stuff, and did a lot of R&D, and we managed to pull it off. But to me, it changed from being a gruesome R-rated movie where the mother gets her head chopped off and it bounces down the stairs and the dog gets eaten by the gremlins, into this sort of pseudo It's a Wonderful Life meets the BURBS kind of thing that it became. And because it was unusual, and because it was the right movie at the right time, it became this unexpected phenomenon. I mean, no one, including me, ever imagined that the picture would be as big a hit as it was. And it became like one of the major pictures of the year, and basically allowed me to have a career. And I owe it all to the fact that Gizmo didn't turn into Stripe.
A lot of people here may not know that you were one of the minds behind the original version of Jaws 3. How would that have been a different film if you would have been at the helm of it?
Well, that was the movie that took me to Universal for the first time. That was I had just made a picture called Piranha, which was successful, and I was asked to do a movie by the National Lampoon, and which had just made Animal House, and the Zanuck and Brown people who had made Jaws 2. And there was a little bit of a contretemps about Jaws 2 because Universal was kind of annoyed about Gremlins, about Piranha, because it was coming out the same year as Jaws 2, and they were threatening lawsuits. And Spielberg apparently saw it and said, "No, it's a parody. It's okay." And so once again, he sort of came to my rescue. Anyway, they had this project called Jaws 3 People Zero. And one of the writers was John Hughes, and it was a National Lampoon picture. But the problem was that the Zanuck and Brown people wanted to make a PG, and the National Lampoon people wanted to make an R-rated movie. And so there was a lot of, I guess the word would be infighting, about what the movie was going to look like. And me, I'm the guy who's just brought over from Roger Corman. I'm just the cog in the machine. It's my first studio movie. I show up and they hand me a whole bunch of storyboards that are already pre-drawn. And they said, "Here's your storyboards." And I said, "Well, don't I?" I said, "No, just do these. They'll be fine." And I was getting a taste of studio filmmaking. And having come from my background with Roger Corman, where everything was very ad hoc and very fast, and we really pretty much got to do what we wanted as long as it was done, cheaply. I kind of wasn't used to this. And it looked at various points like the picture was going to fall apart. It was supposed to star Bo Derek, and who I met, who was very nice. And I met her with her boyfriend, who was less nice. Anyway, it started looking like it was going to fall apart. And my friend Mike Fennell, who had worked on the other pictures I'd done, was over at Avco Embassy, and he said, "There's this werewolf picture that's going over there, and they're going to fire the director. And do you think you want to do a werewolf picture?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't think I could just walk out on this picture I'm doing at Universal. It's a big picture." And so I went to my executive and I said, what's going on with the movie? I mean, can you give me a little hint about whether or not it's going to happen or not? And he said, "I can't tell you anything." And so I just took a flyer and I said, "Okay, I'll gamble that this movie's going to fall apart, and I'll go do the other movie." And sure enough, the day that I said I would do the other picture, Jaws 3 fell apart. And I'm not so sure that it wasn't a good idea, that maybe I was better off doing the low-budget werewolf picture than I was doing the high-budget Jaws 3 picture, which I just don't think anybody involved in it really agreed on what it should be. And I thinking back at other experiences I've had since, I think it probably would have been a bad idea.
Was your first picture for a studio Twilight Zone the movie?
Yes, because when I talked to Stephen about doing Gremlins, we were sort of developing it, and during that period, the Twilight Zone movie came up, and it was sort of like, well, let's have Joe do an episode. He's already working on Gremlins. And that's how George Miller got his episode. He came to visit Stephen, and he walked in the door, and Stephen said, "Oh, let's have him do an episode." And then after a while, it was like, how many episodes are there going to be on this picture? But I always thought the Twilight Zone movie was a missed opportunity, apart from all of the surus about the accident and everything, because the studio insisted on remaking existing episodes. And the great thing about the Twilight Zone was that they took this great material by all these short story writers and turned them into these great teleplays. And they all had twist endings. And the one thing you didn't want to do is you didn't want to know what the twist ending was. But if you remade episodes that everybody knew, then obviously they were all going to know how it ended. But nonetheless, that's what they wanted to do. And it was a lot of fun. Richard Matheson wrote mine, and it was a great opportunity to work with him. And George Miller and I got a lot of good press out of it because the other two episodes weren't as well received, and so it was a good thing for us. And it was a good introduction to studio filmmaking, because in that particular case, the studio was so wary about the movie because of all the bad publicity of the accident that they left George and I completely alone to do our stuff. And we figured, hey, what a good deal this is. We get to work on a studio a lot. We get all these fancy people, and nobody tells us what to do. This is terrific. Well, we found out on our next pictures that really wasn't the way it worked.
Twilight Zone the movie was yours. George, I love George Miller's, but yours was the only one that felt like, even though it was a remake of the Bill Mummy story, it felt original. It felt.
I wanted to fix it so that that it would take at least half the episode for you to realize which episode was being remade. So we tried to change all of this, because the original episode was terrific, and it was like, wow, why would you want to do that over? So we just went back to the short story and tried to find a way to present it in a different light, and still have it be the same story, and it worked out.
And yours was the one of the few, or maybe the only one, with original Twilight Zone actors in it, correct?
Well, that was my idea. I just wanted to have as many Twilight Zone. I would love the Twilight Zone, and I wanted to have as many Twilight Zone references and actors and stuff as possible. Almost all the actors were people who were in the original show.
You see a lot of parallels between the career of yours and John Landis, and I know that the two of you are friends. Where did that happen? How did that come about?
We're just movie buffs and film geeks, and John was established much before I was. His movie Schlock was made before I even came out here, and he worked as an extra on Once Upon a Time in the West. And Kelly's Heroes. I mean, he had a pretty good foothold in the business before I came out here, and we we liked the same movies, and then eventually we had two dueling werewolf movies. Which was because, John had been telling Rick Baker that he was going to make American Werewolf for years, and then he never made it. And then I got a chance to make The Howling, and I said to Rick, well, you didn't make the picture with John. Why don't you just come over and do our picture? And he said, okay. And so he started working on it for about a week, and John found out, and he was, what do you mean? I'm going to make my movie. And somehow he came up with the money, and he made his picture. And so Rick went to do his movie, and Rob Bottin, who I'd worked with before on PIRHANA, came in and took over the special effects stuff, and it worked out. I mean, they're two completely different kinds of movies, and they're certainly lit completely differently. But it was odd that they not only did they come out that year, but also Full Moon High and The Wolfen and The Werewolf of Washington. I mean, there were all these other movies that came out in the same. It was the year of the werewolf for some reason.
And it was the first werewolf movie in 21 years? Is
No,
that right?
I think the last one was The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, made here, actually, in 1973.
I really hope to see The Howling as a future Halloween Horror Nights maze. If anyone in the room can make that happen. You talked a little bit about working with Roger Corman. How close is Hollywood Boulevard to how your life actually was, the film that you...
Hollywood Boulevard, which is my first movie, is a virtual documentary about how it was to make low-budget movies in the 70s, a long-vanished era which allowed many of us to get our first taste of filmmaking, because this was we were all people who, many of them came out from the East Coast or elsewhere, come to Hollywood. You can't get in the union if you haven't made a movie. You can't make a movie unless you're in the union. And so there was this proliferation of low-budget, non-union movies made for drive-ins that were, and later for VHS, that became the entry point for all these young people who couldn't work at the studios because it was, you just couldn't get in. It was a closed shop. And we all developed a tremendous amount of, experience in how to make a movie when there's no money and no time. And you learn lessons that you carry with you. And even when you're making expensive movies later, the only thing that counts is what happens between when you say action and when you say cut. And on a big movie, there's lots of time between those two things. And on a small movie, there's less time. But ultimately, it's all about what happens when the camera's on. And you do learn how to make the most out of whatever they give you.
And how does it differ making films now versus making films of the 80s, the 90s? I know that you've talked about mid to late 90s as kind of when the studios became more corporate. Did you find it more difficult or easier now with Netflix and Hulu?
Well, it's harder to make movies today because there are less movies to make, and the ones that are made generally are the studio pictures tend to be very expensive tentpole superhero movies that are filled with special effects and not particularly character driven, but are usually greenlit because they can make more of them. I mean, it's the dream of every studio to make Lord of the Rings, to make the Harry Potter movies, to make movies, the Fast and the Furious, to make movies that they know they can make more of and will become increasingly, popular. It's a little harder to get somebody to say, well, let's take a flyer on this movie. I mean, when Roger Rabbit was made, it was not a guaranteed success. And they had ready to use some TV spots where Roger Rabbit would beg you to go to the movie because it didn't make money the week before. I mean, it takes a certain amount of gall to be able to say, we're going to spend this amount of money on this idea that is untried. It's not a remake. It's not a title that people have already heard. It's just a new idea. Now, to me, that's where you hit the jackpot. I mean, certainly Gremlins was a new idea. There weren't a lot of other movies like that. And Ghostbusters came out the same year, another picture that was like not a sequel, not a remake. So if you really want to hit the jackpot, you want to do something that's offbeat and new. But in today's world, where it costs so much money to make a movie and so much money to distribute it, people tend to play it safe. And if I was an executive, I can't say that I blame them. I mean, a lot of them don't last long, And I've been in situations where my movie is being released by a new regime of a studio that doesn't really care about that movie because they didn't make it and they can't claim anything for it, and so they'd rather just get rid of it and make their movies. So the corporate aspect of it has become more and more pervasive, and I think what we get, the movies show it. But then you say, well, the independent world, you can always make a movie for less money, which you can, and now it's amazing. You can make that. You can do what Coppola said. He always said that people can make their own movies. Well, now they can. They can make them on their computer. They can edit them. They can score them. They can But then once they're done with it, then what do they do with it? How do you show it? How do you get your movie to be seen by people who have so many entertainment choices? When I started in the business, there weren't that many entertainment choices. There weren't even that many TV stations. It was pre-cable. So now it's like anybody they have video games, they have zillions of things that they can do to occupy their time, and movies are only part of it. And that's why I think they've tried to make them into such events. It's because, well, if I'm going to take time out of my schedule of all the other stuff I have to do, I might as well be getting something for it. So, the idea of saying, well, I'm going to make another Little Miss Sunshine and I'm going to make a lot of money, that's not as easy to do anymore. Because if you don't play theatrically, people don't know about the movie. If you go to Netflix, now you're on a list with a bunch of other titles, and nobody knows what they are. They're just a bunch of titles. And if there's a billboard somewhere, maybe that's and then if you go to video on demand, which my last two pictures basically did, the problem is that when people call them up on the computer, the first 7 sites are pirate sites, and you're not going to get any money from that. So the whole VOD idea of that's going to be the savior of the movie business. No, it's not. It's going to be the savior of the piracy business because the movie people don't make any money from it. So it's become a very, very odd situation where most filmmakers spend their time looking around for money to get their movie made, from independent sources. I mean, that's the way Orson Welles lived the last 30 years of his life, was just basically going around asking for money and hardly ever getting to make a movie. And I think that a lot of filmmakers feel that they're kind of in that same boat.
Rumor has it that you have your hand in bringing a horror museum to Los Angeles. Where are we at with that? What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's a bunch of us who like this genre and feel that it's, it's amazing because when I was a kid, this was a very maligned genre and not taken seriously at all. And now it's become one of the few genres in the movie business that actually generates money. And so in an effort to sort of, familiarize people with the history of it, a group of us have tried to put together this Hollywood Horror Museum, which is allied with the Science Fiction Museum. And people who collect props and people who collect costumes and people who sculpt and various effects studios and everything have all banded together to try to get a traveling exhibition going. With ultimately, hopefully, having a permanent site. And it's something. It is if you Google Hollywood Horror Museum, you'll get all the information, and you can be a part of it if you like, or you can just follow the progress of it. But it's something that it's a real thing, and it's got real people behind it.
What is your favorite horror movie of all time?
Oh, that's like saying, what's your favorite movie of all time? I mean, it's like you ask me on Wednesday, it's one movie. You ask me, 2 days later, it's a different movie. I like the old Universal pictures. I like I like The Innocents. I like movies that are subtle. But I also like, Blood and Thunder kind of George Romero movies. I mean, it's a rich genre, and it's actually full of interesting political aspects. There's a reason why there have been so many interesting studies made. I mean, the Stephen King's book, which came out a long time ago, is full of really interesting analyses of why these pictures have remained popular. Even in the face of people saying, zombie movies, remember? Zombie movies used to be the lowest rung on the cinematic ladder, almost as low as superhero movies, which were really the lowest. I mean, the early superhero serials were like $1.98, and they were only for kids. And now it's like, they're holding up the tents of all the studios in town. But zombie movies were particularly odious because they were just treated like crap, and they never, Zombies of Muratow and these movies that had no budget movies. And now, World War Z. It's like, okay, now we're spending a lot of money on zombie movies. We had zombie apocalypse commercials on TV. It's just really odd how inside out all of that aesthetic has become.
One of the things I love that they do at Amoeba Music is having the display rack of DVDs with notes from the employees saying, watch this movie for this reason. And I feel like that's what Trailers from Hell is your recommendations.
Yeah, what you're doing is you're curating. You're saying, there's so many movies to see and so little time that you really need somebody to say, point you to something. Try this. You might like this. You wouldn't have ordinarily heard of this, but just try it out and see what you think. And then that connects to something else. And before you know it, you've got a whole network of things that you've just discovered that are, things, part of your life that you never knew about. And I can't stress too strongly that, the riches of the past there's so much to be mined in them. And they're now so available to see that it's criminal to not take advantage of this opportunity. I tell you, when I came out here in 1973, I started collecting 16mm movies because there was no other way that I could be sure to see a picture. If there was a movie that was going to be on TV at 11 o'clock at night and you didn't watch it, you weren't going to see it again for another year or a year and a half. It was like you had to stay up, put toothpicks in your eyes, and particularly if they're in the middle of the night, because you're not going to see Devil Girl from Mars anymore. They're only going to run it once every 5 years, and so now we have an opportunity to see these things, and we should take advantage of it.
I like that you've been such a huge advocate of a Universal picture called Hell's a Poppin'.
Try to get the studio to bring it back. There's a rights problem with that.
Is it still? It's not on DVD.
Well, Olsen and Johnson were comedians who used to do interactive stuff, and from my movies and my interest in William Castle that I really liked the idea of interacting with the audience. And Hell's a Poppin' was a play where every night was different, and there were all these gags that would go out into the audience. At one point, a train looked like it was coming through the back of the theater, and it was just cool stuff. And so they made a movie about it here at Universal, and what they did is they took that idea and they made a movie about making a movie. And so the first reel and a half of Hell's a Poppin' is just about them making the movie that you're watching and talking to the screen and talking to the projectionist, and it's a hilarious, very meta movie, way years ahead of its time. And for whatever reason, when Jerry Lewis tried to revive it for Broadway, the Alexander Cohen estate were the producers, and the show was not successful, and so they own the rights. And so everywhere in the world that you go, Canada, Europe, whatever, you can see this picture. But the one place you can't see it legally is here. And Universal has great materials on it. They've got a great negative, and they could make prints, and they could put it out on DVD, but they can't because legally, the Alexander Cohen estate has no interest in the fact that they own it. They don't want to hear about it. They don't care. Drop dead. And so the only way you can certainly see it. I mean, you can get it online. You can get it from Canada. The prints are out there. But it's a movie that should be really well known, and it's not, unfortunately.
And yeah, if you have a chance, go on YouTube. You can watch it on there if no other way. But there's a moment where the actors actually leave and sit down and start watching the movie and providing commentary. And it seems like that's where Mystery Science Theater must have come from because, very funny movie. Who has questions for Joe Dante? I have a million questions.
I've answered everything already. There can't possibly be any questions.
Oh, look at that. Already seeing 4 hands up. A microphone right over there if you want to, sir in the red shirt, if you want to ask a question.
We haven't brought up INNERSPACE yet. Which is a big favorite. But my question isn't even about that. My question is about the Explorers.
Thanks for the plug, though.
Thank you. The Explorers didn't end the way you wanted it to. Can you talk about that?
Well, it didn't end the way I wanted it to because I was hoping it would be a successful movie, and that was a bad end. The problem with Explorers was that it was the movie I referred to. I was asked to do this picture after Gremlins when I was, quote, hot. And I was like, let's get the guy who did Gremlins. And Wolfgang Petersen was going to make this picture, and he wanted to make it in Bavaria, and the studio decided they didn't want it to look like a Never-Ending Story, which was his previous picture. And so they said no, and they asked me to do it. So it was back in the era when they would send you a script and have numbers on it. so that you can't duplicate it or else they'll know where it came from. But even so, they would sit there while you read it, and then they took it away. So it was like top secret, hush hush. And it was about 3 kids who build a spaceship and fly off into space and meet aliens. And I thought after doing Gremlins, well, it sounds like a little movie. It's like a cute, kind of like a Huey, Dewey, and Louie kind of a picture. And of course, it was much more complicated than that. The issue was that they wanted it right away. They wanted to make the movie immediately, and they wanted to have it out, like, in a couple of months. And this was, I think, in October, and they wanted to have it out in June. And it was a lot of work. And so I made a mistake. I said, this isn't really very realistic. You're really not going to probably get this in time. And then they said, well, but it would be nice if we got it in time, wouldn't it? And I said, well, yeah, I guess it would be nice. Well, that meant I'm going to do it, and it'll be done in time. And so to compound the problem, there was no third act. And we had to sort of make it up as we went along. And during the last part of shooting, there was a rumor that the studio was going to change hands. And so the executive that was on the movie called me specifically. This is a real Hollywood story. Called me to say, now, I know you've probably heard that there's stuff going on. I just want you to know I'm going to be here for you. And I said, oh, that's reassuring. The next day, I read in the paper, gone to Disney. So I'm stuck now. I've got new people coming in who are taking over the picture and the studio, and they are not interested at all in what's being made. All they want to do is get rid of it because they want to do their movies. And so they said, well, you got to just stop work on the movie. And I said, well, but we're not, just stop. Just don't finish it. Just finish it. Just, mix it and we'll release it. So it's a rough cut. The movie that got released was the rough cut. And it's in the way of making a movie, there's 3 ways it's written. It's written when it's written, and then it's written when it's shot, and then it's written when it's edited. And that's when you find the movie. That's when you see that's where you perfect the movie that you maybe thought you were making, or maybe you discover a better movie in there. But we never got to do that. We just assembled the footage and had one preview, and they said, make it shorter. And so we cut out a party scene in the middle and made it shorter, and then it went out, where it proceeded to lay a gigantic egg with posters that said, from the director of Gremlins. So it wasn't a career highlight. However, that said, it's a lovely movie. It's got some really nice things in it. It's just not quite the movie that I had in mind.
Is there any hope of seeing
an enterprising guy came to me a couple of years ago and said, what if we just sort of went over there and tried to get the footage back, and you could put out your own director's cut? And I said, yeah, okay. And then the studio was A, not interested. B, you're lucky it's out at all. C, we threw it all away. So it is what it is, and that's what it's going to be.
Scream Factory has been treating your films, exquisitely. I love what they did with Piranha. Have they mentioned, doing any kind of Matinee as a special edition? Anything?
Matinee has a special edition in Europe, where I have a somewhat higher profile. They have put out a version of Matinee with lots of extras. And they put out a version of the Burbs, which has not only extras, but it has the rough cut of the movie on it, which has got a different ending, and it's got a lot of different stuff in it, and it's also got the temp track on it, which is all Ennio Morricone music. I have no idea how they got the rights to do that, but there's a French version of the Burbs and a British version of the Burbs, which have all these extras and stuff on it. America, not so interested.
So we need to get international Blu-ray players. Yes. Question, yes, at the mic.
Yes, I'm a proactive question asker because I'm here lined up. Hi, Joe. So my brother's favorite movie growing up is Gremlins 2. So I actually saw Gremlins 2 about 3 zillion times before I had actually seen the first Gremlins, which my husband showed me this year at almost 35 years old. And then Key and Peele, I don't know if you're familiar.
I saw that.
Okay, so there was an amazing sketch where they talk about like Gremlins 2 and how it was going to happen, and like we're having a fruit gremlin.
It's completely accurate.
It was
it's
amazing.
as if they were there.
Right. So But I am interested because having seen Gremlins 2 3 million times throughout my life and then seeing Gremlins 1 the first time at 35 years old, I was very confused about Gremlins 1 because I come from Gremlins 2, which is a very different kind of movie. So how did that manifest and were Key and Peele accurate?
Well, Key and Peele were completely accurate, as if they were in the room. But how did you understand Phoebe Cates' story about Lincoln's birthday if you hadn't seen her story about Christmas? It's essential viewing. Gremlins 2 was one of those things where they came to me and they said, look, we tried to make a sequel to this movie. We didn't really like it the first time, but it made all this money. So why don't you come back and, we'll let you do whatever you want. And we want it in some month or other. And it was great. I mean, it was 3 times the budget. The technology had improved immensely, so we got to do a whole bunch of stuff we could never have done before. It's a movie about sequels and why there shouldn't be a sequel to Gremlins. And it's got a character in it that John Glover plays, who is based as a kind of composite of Ted Turner and Donald Trump. I like ours better. And it's got a lot of sort of funny hip stuff about the 90s and what they were going to be like. In fact, when Spielberg saw the movie, he said, oh my God, is this what the 90s are going to be like? And they kind of were. So that was a movie that was really a lot of fun to make, and I prefer to the original. But not that it's a better movie, but it's just more personal to me.
At what point did you think, oh, let's have Chuck Jones have Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck open Gremlins 2?
Well, Chuck and I had been friends, and I just thought that the sensibility of the movie was such that it was very Looney Tunes, and I wanted to send a message at the beginning of the movie that, first of all, I was missing the fact that they used to run cartoons in front of movies. That was a great thing about going to the movies when I was a kid. And then the cartoons turned to be Pink Panther and Ratfink and Boo Boo and stuff, and it was like, after a while, forget the cartoons. But this was a way of getting a cartoon in the movie and having it, be in the movie too.
I appreciate in your film Burying the X that you referenced the New Beverly or shot at the New Beverly. That's something that they do with their films is play cartoons before the movies. Why did you pick the New Beverly of all the cinemas
because we
here?
got it for free.
Oh, there you go. Who has a question? Nader.
So it's actually a really quick question. If the Klopeks weren't Slavic, then what were they?
They never said they weren't Slavic. Bruce Dern says, "Is that a Slavic name?" And then he says, "No, it came with the frame." The whole thing with the Klopeks is that when the movie was originally written, you never found out what they were up to. They just took Tom Hanks away in the ambulance and killed him. That was the original ending. And then when they hired Tom, they said, "Well, we can't kill Tom Hanks now. We have to explain what they're doing." And there was no explanation for what they were doing, and none of it made any sense. And so we just shot a bunch of different endings. There was one where the garbage men were in the trunk, and there was one where the cheerleaders were in the trunk, and finally we ended up with skulls because we had done a skull thing, and it was fine. I mean, it's a behavioral movie. It's not a plot movie.
Hi, Joe. So when I was really, really little, I was trying to convince my grandmother to take me to see Small Soldiers because it was the coolest looking thing I had ever seen trailer-wise in a long time, because I couldn't believe that there were... Because we'd seen Toy Story, but everything's animated. Now we have actual walking, talking toys, and I was too young, according to them, to go and stuff. But can you just talk about how that movie came to be? Was that something you wanted to do or something somebody approached you? Et cetera, et cetera.
That was a movie that was on the Spielberg schedule for a number of years, and the reason they did was because the technology really didn't exist, and it hardly even existed when we made it. And we originally planned to use a lot of Stan Winston's puppets, and the bottom line was basically that it was so complicated to get them to move from one place to another that we just said, well, ILM can do this. And because they didn't have to move like animals and be smooth and everything, it just became simpler to have a lot of it done with CGI. And we never anticipated there would be so much CGI in the movie. And it's, I think it's a nice movie for kids because the message is that just because you have a uniform doesn't make you good, and just because you look funny doesn't make you bad. And it was, and again, it was another movie that we made here, and I love working here.
What was it like working with Phil Hartman, who I love everything he says under his breath in Small Soldiers. And I think World War II is my favorite war.
Phil was a wonderful guy, and he had played the president for me in an HBO movie that I did called The Second Civil War, which nobody has seen, but I'm telling you, if you can get a hold of it, it is so prescient. It's like it's all taking place as we speak. But he played this sort of, now that I look at it, kind of Trumpian president. And he was just great, and he said he would do this, and the tragedy of it is that we got along so well. I knew he would become part of my stable. He would be another one of the actors that I would use in movie after movie. And right after the picture was finished, he passed away, and it didn't exactly help the movie because there was a lot of. There's something about a comedy, going to see a comedy with somebody who's just passed away. It didn't help Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be, which is one of the great movies of all time, which has Carole Lombard in one of maybe her greatest performance. But she was killed in an air crash just before the movie came out, and people just went, "Oh, it's not funny." She's like, "Oh," it's just. I mean, after years go by, of course, we watch all these people who have passed away, and we don't think about that. But at the time, it was a downer for Small Soldiers.
Hello, Joe. I was one of your stand-ins for Erie, Indiana. What? Hi again. And I can attest to the way you work with the kids, with Jason and Justin and Omri. Could you talk to them, not at them? And they really enjoyed working with you. Do you have any fond memory, funny story, anything from Erie that you would like to share?
Well, if anybody here remembers Erie, Indiana, besides you, I will be impressed. It was a junior X-Files, before X-Files, and it was a show that NBC liked, and unfortunately didn't like enough to not put opposite 60 Minutes, and so it didn't set the world on fire. But it was a very clever show, and I did the pilot, and then I liked the show, and I stayed on as the quote creative consultant, which meant that I could get all my friends' jobs. They lost faith in the show in the middle of the season, and they thought that the problem was that the lead kid was too young. And so they had a plan to replace him with another actor. So they brought in an older actor to play a character called Dash X, and he comes in, and he's supposed to ultimately replace the lead kid as the lead in the show. But then they canceled the show. So the last episode of the show, in which I play myself badly, even after a lifetime of rehearsal, is the kid in the show wakes up and realizes he's an actor on Erie, Indiana, and that he's going to be replaced by this other kid. It was called Reality Takes a Holiday. It's the last episode. It was directed by Ken Kwapis, and it's really wonderful. It's a great show. It's out on a kind of a dodgy DVD set, but every kid that I have shown this show to has watched every episode over and over and over because it's a wonderful show, and unfortunately was shot on film, edited on tape, and now only exists on dupe tapes. Like so many things that were made for television in the 90s, that there's no film element to go from, and so it'll never be on Blu-ray. It'll never look any better than it does. But most kids don't seem to care about that. If you've got a kid, I would really recommend getting a hold of this show because it's really a lot of fun. Thank you.
I have a question about Gremlins in the scenes with the blender and the microwave. What did you do to make that happen? What liquid was used? How was that done?
Well, that's a technical question. I think the one in the blender was just a gremlin in a blender with a lot of goop. And the one in the microwave was designed to explode when the door was closed, and it was sort of a lot of stuff on Gremlins was shot after the actors left because it's expensive to keep them waiting around while the special effects don't work, and so the show was designed to shoot out the actors as much as possible, and then do all the inserts and stuff with the Gremlins for like another month afterward. In fact, we shut down, I think, for a month to sort of retool because they fell apart quickly. And it was very goopy. Everybody was filthy and covered with sticky stuff, and it was not a clean movie to make. But we had a lot of fun. What can I say? Give me that guy. Except for his drinking problem, he was very cooperative. But the problem is that in order to fit all the gears and stuff into something this small, you have to have a lot of replacement heads and a lot of replacement faces and stuff. And so he would break down a lot. I mean, actors have breakdowns, but he would break down a lot, to the point that one day the production manager came to the set and everyone was asleep because Chris Walas was in his trailer trying to fix Gizmo. It made us all look like we were kind of layabouts, but it was a taxing movie. But he's gone through rehab and he's fine now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure, like myself, there's probably a lot of aspiring artists and filmmakers in the room. And I was just wondering if you had any advice you wish someone would have given you when you first started out, and if that's something you'd be willing to share with us.
Well, I'm often asked, how what's my story? How did I get started? And I always demur because the difference in the business between now and when I started is so monumental that none of the stories that I could tell would have any relevance to you at all. But the one thing that I would say is that take every opportunity that you have to do your work. To whether it's, work with your friends. If your friends are making movies, help them out. If you're making a movie, get everybody else to help you out. And then do all the jobs yourself. Do everything that you can. Do lighting, do sound, do editing, do music. Do all the things that you can do to learn how to do those jobs. Because the one thing that I had going for me when I started for Roger Corman was that none of us knew what we were doing. And everybody on a movie would switch jobs, like on the second day. It was like the wardrobe guy decides, I don't like wardrobe, I want to be an art director. And we would learn everybody else's job because it was such a hothouse atmosphere. And so, as Howard Hawks once said, nobody ever got to be a good director by not directing. So if you can find opportunities, even if it's not movies, if it's just plays or, community group, whatever. It's just immerse yourself in the business of make-believe and it'll help.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that Explorers didn't turn out the way you wanted it, but it was great for me as a kid. It was definitely very formative for my sense of humor and my sense of imagination. So thanks. I also wanted to ask about INNERSPACE, since we didn't get to earlier. Not any specific questions, but since somebody mentioned it and it was a great movie, just thoughts. I recently was reading Martin Short's autobiography, in which he talks about what a delightful experience it was. And then the second question was if you're excited about anything that you're doing right now.
Okay. Well, INNERSPACE was one of the most fun movies to make I ever did because of the cast. It was just wonderful. It was originally supposed to be a straight spy movie. It was not supposed to be a comedy. A spy movie about a guy who gets shrunk down and put inside another guy. So I said, I don't know. I don't know if that works. So I went off and made Explorers. And then when I came back, they had hired a writer named Jeffrey Boehm who said, well, what if the movie was about Jerry Lewis being shrunk, about Dean Martin being shrunk down and injected into Jerry Lewis? And I thought, okay, that I can understand. And so we did the picture, and it was we managed to work it out so that Dennis Quaid and Martin Short, who were almost never on screen together, could always ad-lib with each other. And so a lot of their dialogue is stuff that they just sort of made up. If I did a scene with Dennis, then Martin would be off screen in a booth, and vice versa. And Marty was wonderful to work with because if you did 10 takes, take one would be so different from take 10, you'd think it was a different movie. And he would always beg for more takes in the voice of Katharine Hepburn. Please, Joe, please, one more. Please, one more take, please. It was just a tremendous amount of fun. And we got to shoot in San Francisco, which is always fun to shoot in. And ILM won an Academy Award for special effects that I think still look pretty good. It was a high point, What was the other part of the question? Oh, what am I excited about? Well, I mean, there's a lot of young directors coming up that I think are really interested. You see Get Out. I mean, it's a pretty good movie. And the fact that movies like that can be made today, can still get made and still get distributed and still get seen, is a plus. Because, after the umpteenth superhero movie, which has a guy fighting another guy on a girder hanging from a helicopter in outer space for 3 reels, you just sort of want to see movies with people in them again. And I think the fact that there's still an audience for that is encouraging.
Did you ever go to Epcot Center and ride Body Wars and think, oh my God, they stole my movie?
No, I thought that when I ran the InnerSpace ride at the Monsanto. You remember that? The Monsanto ride at Disneyland was called InnerSpace. Journey into InnerSpace. Paul Frees was doing all sorts of voice stuff, and that was called InnerSpace. But the problem with InnerSpace was it was called InnerSpace. It was a terrible title, and one of the reasons it didn't make any money. But this guy's got a question.
I feel like you've been really successful at kind of doing hybrid genres. Could you talk a little bit about injecting horror with comedy? And I mean, are there rules of thumb? Were you ever afraid that people wouldn't know what they were getting into because it wouldn't be, is it this or is it that? But it's been really successful, and I mean, Get Out's a great example. So just about, I mean, do you know what you're doing when you're getting in there, or are you just kind of finding your way?
The only people that I've ever dealt with have had problems with that are studio executives. On the first days dailies of the Howling, the head of the studio said, "Is this a comedy or horror picture? I'm confused." And of course, it was both. I mean, I've always thought that comedy and horror are very close, particularly because horror is so absurd. And, speaking of Universal, I mean, I go back to James Whale, and The Invisible Man was on again recently on TCM, and it's a movie where you're encouraged to laugh at the Invisible Man because he's crazy and he does crazy things, but then he beats somebody to death with a stool, and it's like, oh, this is not pleasant. I just think the two things are very allied, and when you see a horror movie with an audience and there's a big gasp, they always laugh afterward. There's a big scare, and they laugh at themselves for being scared, and it's because it's a roller coaster ride. Now, if it's not a jump movie, if it's a creepy hairs on the back of your neck movie, that's a little different. If you see The Haunting, there's a lot of intentional humor in The Haunting in places to relax you so that you can get scared again, and there's a lot to learn from old horror movies.
Sorry, I'm short. A couple weeks ago, we had a Q&A with John Landis, and I asked him this very same
John Landis, they let him in here?
Yes, they did. But I asked him this question, and he kind of went off on a tangent and never really answered it.
Oh, so I'm going to ask it
again to you. More than, or about half of us, I would say, are tour guides. What would you have us impart on the guests about the films you've made at Universal?
Well, first of all, stop mentioning Back to the Future when you go into the Gremlins place.
Okay.
I haven't done that many pictures here. So I mean, I did use the town square in Gremlins, and I did use the I don't know what you call it, the Desperate Housewives land for the Colonial Street for the Burbs, so I don't feel that I need to be invoked, at all. But I do, and as I said, I was impressed with the fact that there was so much more attention paid to facts during the tours now than there were, and I even there's a lot of visual information that I don't remember ever was there before. So whoever's in charge of working this stuff out has obviously been paying attention, and I think that I'm just pleased to see tour guides who are excited about being tour guides. I know that sounds like, well, but they're not scientists. No, they're not. But there's nothing wrong with being a tour guide. It's a good job, and I think there's a lot of people who really appreciate the interaction that people have with the tour guides. And so, as I said, I was impressed with the last experience that I had.
Who was your tour guide? Do you remember?
I wish I could remember that. She had a first name though.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Joe. Ooh. Oh my God, I just hurt myself.
I didn't do it.
So nice to meet you. I'm actually I'm a huge fan of Gremlins. I talk about that every day on my tour. I'm not a tour guide here, but I'm a tour guide at Warner Brothers. So I always say, hey, that's Mrs. Eagle's house where she shoots out the windows and lands on the other side right in front of
Thank you. That's hardly even there anymore. I mean, they've remodeled.
It's still there. It's
they've
still there.
remodeled that so many times.
Yeah, and also the little
That
boy.
whole street is kind of like it's.
Yeah, Kim's Row, and
Yeah.
also the little boy, the stairs.
And that they used to have a great Western town right behind it.
Yeah, we torn that down. Now
I know.
now it looks like Desperate
sad.
Housewife, but
I can't believe the Western Street is still here at Universal. I mean, it's nobody makes Westerns anymore. But
yeah, so you probably get these questions a lot. How did you start? How did you start your first movie? Because right now, a lot of young filmmakers, we start out by doing all the short films or super ultra low budget features, and then just kind of cold call people, but no one will ever respond to us. So how did you start? Because now we're all hustling, but I believe time is different. But back in that time.
Well, back in that time, I made trailers. I started out making trailers and television spots, and then I got a chance to. I was an editor, which is a great way to learn to be a director because you learn about how to construct a scene and what scenes you don't need and what angles you don't need and how you can make a scene shorter, and that's all very useful. But for now, I think the effort is not so much to make your movie, but to get it seen. And I think the YouTube route is pretty deadly because there's so much competition. I mean, how's anybody going to find your film? The best route I've found is film festivals. If you can get your short into a festival and get it seen by somebody who remembers it, and it will lead to more connections with other people. It's not like your short is going to get you the next Star Wars movie, but it's going to get. If somebody likes it, you will meet somebody who meets some. It's all about relationships. It's all in the early movies that I did with Roger Corman. It was the people you met in the crew that you saw over and over. Who a guy who had a van, who you knew was going to get hired because they always hire people who have a van, So chum up with that guy, because he's going to get a job. It's really have as many relationships, with the people that you work with as you can. Because if some of them get to go somewhere, they could take you with them.
What was it like for your first movie? Did you write the script?
My first movie was made for $60,000 on a bet that it was the cheapest movie that had been made at that company. And it was because I'd been making trailers. The idea was that the movie was constructed around footage from all the movies that I'd done trailers for. And so the idea was that it was a movie company making low-budget movies, and our actors were dressed like the people in the clips of the movies, and that became our action scenes. And it was called Hollywood Boulevard, which was a three-girl formula movie where there are always three girls who take their clothes off and get in trouble. And it was a drive-in staple at the time. There were nurses, teachers, and now we had actresses. And it was a way to get to make a movie, and it was made in 10 days. For whatever reason, it cost so little that it made its money back when it was sold to Ceylon or something. So, but as I said, that was such a different world. It's just so not applicable today.
Thank you.
Hi, Joe. I have a question about Gremlins again. I hate to keep bringing it up, but I grew up in the 90s, so I'm familiar with the Gremlins, and I remember watching it as a kid, and I just loved the films, and I was just wondering, in today's day and age of like a bunch of like remakes being, of classic films coming back, would you ever consider like redoing Gremlins?
Well, I think that won't be my decision because I don't, I just directed them. I don't own them. They have been trying to make Gremlins 3 for a number of years. They every so often announce that someone has been hired to write a script or somebody's been hired to direct it, and then it sort of goes away, and then someone else has mentioned that they've been hired, and I have no idea. I mean, it's obviously a catalog title that's very useful for them. Maybe they'll do a stage musical. I don't know. I mean, I really have no idea what's going to happen with that.
I can't imagine a Gremlins film without you and Spielberg connected to it. It just shouldn't happen. But do you have interest in revisiting the Gremlins?
I don't. It is so out of the question that I don't even bother thinking about it.
I was excited to hear about the Traveling Hollywood Horror Museum that you were talking about earlier. So 2 questions. It sounds like from what you were saying, you have some kind of a collection of props and memorabilia yourself. So is that true? And
Well,
if so,
it's not my personal collection, but
do you have a collection at all?
I have some props from stuff that I've done, but I'm not a giant. Some people are like manic collectors of props and have huge dungeons full of stuff that they've bought. Yeah, Del Toro's got a whole house full of stuff that he's done. This is just a group of like-minded people who have managed to, for instance, the Star Trek set, the original Star Trek set was being, I think, sort of pseudo-junked or whatever, and this guy, Houston Huddleston, who was behind this idea, managed to buy it, and so that's a sort of a centerpiece of the sci-fi part of the museum. And there's a lot of collectors who, and people from special effects houses who have actually made some of these things and still have them, that have managed to say, well, you know, if we get this thing together, I can get this and I can put this together, and so. And there's we have interest from the families of Vincent Price and Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and all those names from the past that are part of the idea of being on the board of this thing. So it's really ongoing. I don't know. I can't tell you exactly where or when it's going to happen because I'm not that closely connected to it. But it's a real thing.
Hi, Joe. Long-time listener, first-time caller. The UK Blu-ray for the Burbs mentions Rick Dukeman and Tom Hanks didn't get along on the film. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I wouldn't say they didn't get along. They weren't best buds. I think that Rick, Rick had a very abrasive kind of act that he did, and so there was a certain tension between them, which actually worked out great for the movie. I mean, the relationship they have in the movie is very similar to the relationship they had on the set, and I didn't encourage it. I didn't not encourage it. It was just like, oh, this is something that's fun to watch, and it was fun. And Rick Dukeman won that part over many people who have much bigger names. But when you look at the movie, you can't imagine it without him. I mean, he is really a linchpin of what makes that movie work. And I mean, Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas and all these people who wanted to play the part, they just didn't quite have the quality that he brought to it. And Rick was a fairly well-off guy. He came from some money, and he was a stand-up comedian. And so he didn't make very many movies. He's in Groundhog Day and he's in Die Hard, but he didn't really do that many movies. He's a real asset to the picture. And he's in Gremlins too.
And we're going to do a Joe Dante raffle. We have a Joe Dante bag.
You're raffling me off, folks.
We're going to raffle Joe off. So if Melanie would bring the raffle bag up. But while she's doing that, I just want to ask you, what do you love most about making movies?
Well, I started as an editor, so I really kind of love editing. It's really where you get to fix what you did wrong and improve what you did right. And the other part about making movies is working with actors, because you just never know. They just surprise you so much that so many things turn out better than you ever imagined because somebody has an idea that wasn't in your head, And then there's also the music. I mean, the last thing you do to the movie is put the music on it. And I was lucky to make like 10 films with Jerry Goldsmith, and every single one of them got it 50% better as soon as the music went on. So we used to have a saying on the set when things working out and the scene wasn't very good. Don't worry, Jerry will save it. And he always did.
I love the Looney Tunes score. Was that his last score that he worked on?
That was his last score, and he wasn't able to finish it. The last reel was done by John Debney because Jerry just couldn't. He worked up until the last possible moment, and then he said, I can't do this.
Melanie, if you will come up. Now, last time, Melanie collected all the tickets, and she won the prize, so hopefully she didn't rig it again.
That sounds pretty phony.
So, Joe, if you'll do the honors and select our winner of the Joe Dante grab bag for tonight, I'll grab that.
Am I in there?
You're in there, yes. You'll be in the bag, so climb on in.
So, 914052. Come on down.
Well, I don't think there's any howling stuff in there.
So, Jason.
All right, so we have a Joe Dante grab bag. Inside, you're going to have Piranha and Gremlins on DVD. You're going to have, I want to keep some of this stuff. Gremlin stickers, a matinee button, the original program for the Explorers. There you go. Congratulations, sir. Our next one is going to be tumbler set of the Gremlins here, 2 glasses. So if you'll pick one more raffle ticket here. Don't drink it after midnight. Don't get these tumblers wet after midnight.
Don't tumble after midnight.
Don't tumble after midnight.
914048.
Thank you so much for coming out to talk with us tonight. I know I'll never forget this, so this means a lot that you took the time to come out. And thank you to everyone who came out and had questions and enjoyed the evening with us. So, Mr. Joe Dante, there you go.
Thanks a lot. So who gets Gizmo?